So now we're going to talk about calculating heritability. So what our goal is here, last time we talked about how behavior genetics in the book is, so I'm going to talk to you about what is correct. So calculating heritability. So the goal with behavior genetics is to examine how phenotypes, so that's observable traits, may be attributed to variation in genotypes, genetic structure. Now what heritability does is it tries to make that link. The phenotypic variation, so like what we observe and see, and link that with genotypic / heritability. So the basic idea, and all studies boil down to this, is that we compare similarity in whatever the trait is between people who are or are not related, as well as people who are related to different degrees. So now there are tons of built-in assumptions, and I'll talk a little about them in a couple of slides. But the idea is that for genetic association, that if traits and behaviors are influenced by genes, we expect people who are more genetically similar to be also more similar in whatever the trait is. So height, for example, identical twins are much more similar in terms of height than fraternal twins. So identical twins share all their genes, while fraternal twins are just like siblings who, like, so they have separate, so like fraternal twins don't share the same initial egg. It's just multiple eggs and multiple fertilizations. They just share a womb. They're womb mates. Oh yeah, I'm going to let that one sink in. Womb mates. Because I think it is the best joke pun thing ever. Okay, I'm going to say it one more time and then I'm done. Womb mates. So yeah, DZ twins, womb mates. Yeah, alright, I'm done. I promise. I'm sorry. I can't help myself. So what you can do is compare groups of known relatedness, so identical twins versus fraternal twins or dizygotic twins. Fraternal and dizygotic twins, same thing, for the most part. And so what you do is you compare similarities, and if they're more similar, we will expect to see. Can I help you? We will expect to see, so if there's a genetic influence, the more related you are, the more similar you'll be. But if we don't see differences in similarity across groups, the effect is not genetic. That's the basic idea. And you can examine the heritability for anything. There's papers on the heritability of divorce, the heritability of, which is not like divorce, like there's a divorce gene. It's that you're looking at, because it's like that's a classic case of where it's not like it's a very distant causal pathway. Like it's neuroticism. Neuroticism has a genetic effect, and so people who are more likely to divorce are also more likely to have higher levels of neuroticism. And so, because of the genetic component of neuroticism, divorce is heritable. Boom. Alright, so that's the idea. So what I'm going to do here, I know I promised you no math. You won't have to calculate this, but I'm sorry, I can't help it. I'm a quantitative psychologist. There's going to be math. Sorry. So Falconers Formula is the most basic formula for calculating heritability. What it does is you double the difference in the correlation between identical twins and fraternal twins. And that tells you what the broad heritability is. Now, broad sense heritability is all the genetic stuff. Beyond, including gene by environment interactions. I think, for the most part it includes those. Epigenetic effects, dominance effects, as well as why am I blanking on the freaking term? Additive genetic effects. So all the different kinds of genetic effects that you can think of get captured in broad heritability. And you won't have to identify the specific kinds. But that's the idea. And so RMZ is the identical twin correlation. The RDZ is the fraternal twin correlation. I'm going to illustrate this on the next slide. Yeah, boom, here we go. So here we have data looking at some trait. Let's call it personality. So we have so what we do is we calculate the correlation by group. So we look at all the twins who are identical, and we see what the correlation is amongst each pair. And we find, in this example, the correlation is 0.6, which is pretty high. And now we're going to look at what the correlation is for non-identical twins. So they share half their genes and all their womb. And we can see the correlation is lower. And so what you do to calculate this is you take the difference. So here we got 0.6 minus 0.4, and you get 0.2. So that, and you double that difference. Now the reason why you double it is it's 1 over how related they are. And I'm not going to expect you to be able to explain that double piece, but what this study shows here, this basic calculation, is that 40% of the variation in whatever this trait is explained is explained by genetics. It's not to say it's caused by genetics, but it's associated with it. So for a definition, very subtle. Heritability and the heritability coefficient is the percentage of the variance of a trait in the population that can be attributed to variance in genes. I'm going to repeat that because I think the video just cut out. So heritability and the heritability coefficient is the percentage. So the heritability coefficient is the percentage of the variance of a trait in the population of whatever population you're studying that can be attributed to variance in genes. It's not causal, it's descriptive. That's it. Now, if you want to crawl more deeply into this table, it's table 9.1, page 305. And these are just the average correlations, where age and gender are adjusted for. There are different fun, fancy things you can do, but that's what's happening. So it's a proportion of variance. It's descriptive. It is not like the likelihood of you inheriting that trait from your parents. It is not that. Not that. Okay? It's nothing to do with your parents. Nothing. Alright. So there are tons of tenuous assumptions that go into this really basic correlation. It assumes that there is no interaction between genes and the environment. So you can't have anything in the classic model. There are modeling ways to handle this. So no epigenetic effects where high levels of stress influence the myelin sheath and stuff like that. None of that stuff. You also have lots of strong assumptions about kin similarity. So that's the relatedness. Now in that basic correlation, the reason we double that difference is because of all these assumptions about relatedness. So you have to have random placement of adoptees. So adoptees, it has to be random. Because you're assuming for adoptees that there's no common genetics between them and their other adoptee siblings. You also have to assume that there's equal environments for different kin groups. So that cousins raised in the same home are treated exactly the same way that you would treat full siblings raised in the same home. And as we know from Harry Potter, cousins raised together are not that relationship like the treatment of Harry versus Dudley, is very different than if Dudley had like a twin brother. Dudley Dursley had a twin brother, there would be two ginormous, huge kids, but one wouldn't be living in a cupboard under the stairs because, well, he wouldn't fit. So that equal environment. So like there are ways to test these effects, and just if an assumption is broken, that doesn't mean like that the model is totally wrong. There are ways to work around these. A lot of people will point out this equal environments assumption is a huge issue because twins are dressed matchy-matchy. No. It's got to, so a more feasible aspect of this assumption is that whatever they're similar on has to, like it has to have some kind of relationship or issue with what we're predicting or with what we're trying to describe. So if we were looking at fashion sense, the fact that identical twins are more likely to be matched the same and dressed the same, then we might have a problem with their model. However, if the only thing that the identical twins versus fraternal twins are being like treated about differently is their clothing, that's unlikely to have an impact on how we understand. Sorry, there's a fly. My cats have failed me. That's their only job. Okay, but backing up. So if that assumption is violated, like matchy-matchy clothing, but we're looking at the relationship, like we're looking at trying to describe the heritability of height, it's fine that assumption is violated. It's not going to like the fact that they're matchy-matchy is not going to have any impact on their height. It's not. Because duh. I mean, maybe if you dress them more similarly and feed them lead paint, then maybe it could, but that's the lead paint feeding, not the matchy-matchy. And so, like, you have to kind of think critically about what these assumptions do and when. And this last one is a random mating, which is like the most tenuous assumption ever, right? It's the idea that you randomly pair off and aren't like, there's no mate selection. And the reason why this is an assumption is because we, on average, identical twin or full siblings, half siblings share half their DNA and a quarter. But if you are non-randomly mating, the average relatedness is actually higher. It's like 0.53 or something. And so you can model that. And it turns out it doesn't have a big issue in like the assumption, like in the modeling aspects in terms of bias and things like that. But yeah. So these are assumptions that get a lot of criticism. If you're interested, like I do a lot of lab work on testing these assumptions and simulations. So like hit me up. Yeah. Okay. So that's talking about kind of some of the assumptions. A lot of criticism goes into the assumptions. Now I'm going to I apologize that this is like so much detail that you never wanted. So more about the genetic sources of similarity. So these get broken down into like, so what causes people to be similar? There's more than just genes. Now in personality, we don't talk about the shared environment so much because there's not a lot of evidence that the shared environment impacts personality. But it does. But other traits it does. So things that cause the family members to be more similar are, so genetic effects include genes, and yeah, I literally just said genetic effects include genes. And so what this does is, so it says if you have something that's causing them to be more similar because of heritability, you would expect to see that people who are more biologically related are more similar than non-biologically related folks, like in the same home. So the more related you are, the more similar you're expected to be. So first cousins are expected to be more similar than second cousins and third cousins and fourth cousins, etc. That's one source. That's the genetic piece. Now there's another piece. It's called the shared environment. And that piece is all about similarities within a family, regardless of how related they are. It doesn't matter if they're identical twins, if like they're adopted, if they're half sibs, if they're cousins raised in the same home, anything. It doesn't matter. The idea is that they are more similar because of their common environment, their shared environment. And so, like, twins raised together versus raised apart, differences there. Like that. So if identical twins raised together are more similar than identical twins raised apart, that suggests that the environment they have in common is influencing the trait. Now, in animal modeling, this is called the herd effect. So, like cows and whatnot, it's very charming. I have to share this with everyone because I think it's so cute. But it's like the household effect. Now, all these between family things are all about how people within, like, are more similar within their family compared to other families. These are sources of similarity. Now, within family is sources of differences within the family. So these are things that are the sources why you don't have perfect correlations. So stuff outside the household, like your peer groups, as well as like measurement error. There's lots more stuff that goes into this, but these are the sources that differ with, like, are why people aren't identical. Like, identical twins still aren't identical, like, they're not clones because they have these within family differences that are non-shared environmental effects. Okay, so book is this is the last little piece. No, not really, I lied. But this is a little piece that I want you to, like, distinguish. So here the book says, and not all of this is wrong. So the book says that the heritability coefficient from interpreting how do you interpret differences in heritabilities based on the kind of study? And so the book says that like if you, for example, for like personality data on average, like the heritability from twin studies is about 0.4. Well, the average from non-twin studies, so that's like the book is primarily focused on adoptees. I tend to use full sibs, half sibs, cousins. But what the book means is like adoptee studies. And so when you find this difference between how the study is done, the book suggests, and I really need to write David an email, that the difference is that indicates that there's some interactive effect or multiplicative effect. No, it doesn't. It could be. It's possible, but it's unlikely. What is more likely is that model assumptions have been violated. And so it could be that the genes are non-additive. So like some effects are interactive, but more likely one of those model assumptions, or you could be looking at different populations, has been violated. That's more likely, to be honest, than some like fancy effect. I wish I could say like it's evidence that there's cool stuff happening. No, it's probably a modeling issue. Okay, so next time I'm going to talk about what heritability can tell you, as well as what it doesn't tell you. I know I already hinted at this a little, but I'm going to go into more depth because it's Behavior Genetics Week. So next time, that's where we're going. This time we talked all about like behavior genetics stuff and like what are sources of similarity. I mean, we did stat stuff, I know. I would be lying to you if I said we were doing anything different. Okay, so next time is all about interpretation and what it means. And so I will see you then. Bye-bye.